By the summer of 1942, bomb shelters were everywhere. Not just in Hawaii, not just on the coasts, everywhere. Families in Ohio were digging holes in their backyards. Families in Kansas were reinforcing their basements with concrete. Families in Nevada were stockpiling canned food and bottled water like the apocalypse was coming next Tuesday. And maybe it was. Nobody knew. That was the problem. Nobody knew when the next attack would come or where it would hit. So people prepared for the worst. The government told Americans to build shelters. President Roosevelt said it was a civic duty. Pamphlets were distributed. Blueprints were handed out. Civil defense offices opened in every major city. By the end of 1942, over 2.5 million American families had either built or prepared some kind of bomb shelter. 2.5 million. That is 1 out of every 12 households in the country. But here's the thing nobody talks about. Most of those shelters were garbage. They were built by regular people with no engineering experience. A dad and his teenage son digging a hole in the backyard and covering it with plywood and dirt. A mom stacking sandbags in the basement corner and calling it a shelter. These were not military bunkers. These were homemade death traps that gave families a false sense of security, while the government sold them a fantasy of survival. 14-year-old Helen Kowalski from Detroit remembered the day her father decided to build a shelter. It was March 1942, 3 months after Pearl Harbor. Her father came home from work one day with a shovel, a bag of cement, and a government pamphlet titled How to Build a Family Fallout Shelter in 7 Easy Steps. He told Helen and her 2 brothers they were going to dig right there, in the backyard, under the apple tree. They dug for 2 weeks, every night after dinner. Her father, her brothers, even Helen. They dug a hole 8 feet deep, 10 feet long, 6 feet wide. It was supposed to fit the whole family, plus their dog. When they were done digging, they poured concrete on the floor. Then they built wooden walls and a wooden ceiling. Then they covered the ceiling with dirt. 2 feet of dirt. That was supposed to protect them from bombs. 2 feet of dirt and some plywood. When it was finished, Helen's father stood back and looked at it like he had built the Hoover Dam. He was proud. He had protected his family. He made them all go inside to test it out. It was dark. It smelled like wet dirt and rotting wood. There was one small vent pipe sticking out of the ground for air. Helen's mother brought down blankets and pillows. Her father brought down a radio and a lantern. They sat there in the dark for an hour just to see what it would feel like. Helen's younger brother started crying after 10 minutes. He said he could not breathe. Her mother said he was fine. But Helen could tell her mother was struggling too. The air was thick, heavy. It felt like the walls were closing in. They never used that shelter. Not once. It flooded during the first heavy rain. 3 feet of muddy water filled the hole and destroyed everything inside. Her father tried to pump it out, but the walls collapsed. The whole thing caved in. He spent 2 weeks building it, and it lasted 3 months. After that, he never talked about it again. But Helen remembered. She remembered sitting in that dark hole, thinking this is where we are supposed to die if the bombs come. This is where we are supposed to wait while the world ends above us. Across the country, families were having the same experience. Building shelters that did not work. Spending money they did not have on supplies they would never use. The government told them a basic shelter could be built for $50. That was a lie. Most families spent $200 to $300. Some spent over 1,000. And for what? A hole in the ground that flooded in the rain. A basement corner stacked with sandbags that would do nothing against a real bomb. A backyard bunker that would collapse if you sneezed too hard. But people kept building them because the alternative was doing nothing, and doing nothing felt like giving up, like waiting to die. So they dug. They poured cement. They stockpiled canned beans and bottled water. They convinced themselves that if the bombs came, they would be ready. 13-year-old Thomas O'Malley from Los Angeles lived in a house with no basement. His family could not afford to dig a backyard shelter. So his father converted a closet, a coat closet, 6 feet by 4 feet. He ripped out the rod where the coats hung and bolted metal shelves to the walls. He stocked those shelves with canned food, water jugs, flashlights, batteries, a first aid kit, and a bucket. The bucket was for going to the bathroom, because if the bombs came, they would be in that closet for days, maybe weeks. Thomas's father made them practice. Once a month, the whole family would cram into that closet and shut the door. Thomas, his parents, his 2 younger sisters, 5 people in a 6-by-4-foot space. They would sit there in the dark for an hour, sometimes longer. His father would set a timer. He said they needed to know what it would feel like. They needed to be ready. Thomas hated those drills more than anything. The closet was suffocating. His little sister would always start crying within the first 15 minutes. His mother would try to calm her down, but her voice was shaking. You could hear it, the fear, the claustrophobia. Thomas would close his eyes and try to imagine he was somewhere else, anywhere else, but he could not. He could hear everyone breathing. He could smell the sweat. He could feel his sister's elbow digging into his ribs. And every time he thought the same thing. If the bombs really come, this is where we die. Not outside, not in the street, in this closet, in the dark, together. They practiced that drill for 3 years, once a month, every month. By 1945, Thomas could sit in that closet for 2 hours without moving, without speaking, without panicking. He had trained himself to shut down, to go numb. Years later, he said that closet ruined him. Even as an adult, he could not be in small spaces, could not ride in elevators, could not sleep with the door closed. That closet taught him what it felt like to be buried alive while you were still breathing. But at least Thomas's family had a plan. Millions of families did not even have that. They had no shelter, no supplies, no idea what to do if the sirens went off. In rural areas, people were told to go to the nearest ditch and lie flat. In cities, they were told to go to the basement of the nearest large building. But what if there was no ditch? What if there was no building? What if you were just a kid walking home from school when the bombs started falling? 9-year-old Alice Brennan from Philadelphia asked her teacher that exact question. It was during a school assembly in April 1942. A civil defense officer was explaining duck and cover drills. He said, "If you see a flash of light, drop to the ground immediately. Cover your head and neck. Do not look at the flash. Do not run. Just drop." Alice raised her hand and asked, "What if I am on a bridge when it happens? What if there is nowhere to drop?" The officer paused. He looked at her. He said, "Then you pray." The whole auditorium went silent. Alice sat back down. She never asked another question. By 1943, air raid drills were a weekly routine in every school across America. 16 million children participated. When the bell rang, You dropped. No hesitation, no questions. You hit the floor, covered your head, and stayed down until the teacher said it was safe. Some schools had designated shelter areas in the basement. Others just had you hide under your desk, as if a wooden desk would protect you from a bomb that could level a building. Kids learned to live with the drills. They learned to live with the fear, but it changed them. 12-year-old Barbara Flynn from Boston started having nightmares. Every night, the same dream. She would be at school. The sirens would go off. She would try to run, but her legs would not move. She would watch the other kids disappear into the basement, and she would be stuck, frozen. Then, the bombs would hit. She would wake up screaming, soaked in sweat. Her mother would come in and hold her, tell her it was just a dream. But it did not feel like a dream. It felt real, because it could be real at any moment. Barbara was not the only one. A study conducted in 1945 by the Office of War Information found that 67% of children in coastal states experience nightmares related to bombing or invasion. 67%, more than half. These were not children living in a war zone. These were American kids living in American cities that had never been attacked. But the fear was so real, so constant, that their minds created the war in their sleep. Some families tried to make the shelters feel normal, homey, safe. 15-year-old Margaret Walsh from San Francisco remembered her mother decorating their basement shelter like it was a guest bedroom. She hung curtains, put down a rug, brought in a small table with a vase of fake flowers. She even hung pictures on the walls, pictures of the family at the beach, at Christmas, smiling, happy, as if pretending the shelter was a nice place would somehow make it less terrifying. But it did not work. Margaret said the decorations just made it worse, because no matter how many curtains you hung or how many fake flowers you put on the table, you still knew what that room was for. It was for hiding, for waiting, for hoping the bombs did not fall on your house. And every time Margaret went down there for a drill, she would look at those pictures on the wall and think about how fragile everything was, how fast it could all disappear. The worst part was not knowing when it would end. The drills, the fear, the waiting. Kids went to school every day, not knowing if they would make it home. Parents went to work, not knowing if their house would still be standing when they got back. And everyone just kept going, kept pretending things were normal. Because what else could you do? By the time the war ended in 1945, millions of American children had spent years living in a state of constant readiness, constant fear. They had practiced dying. They had imagined their own death so many times that it stopped feeling like imagination. It felt like inevitability. And even after the war ended, even after the sirens stopped and the shelters were abandoned, that feeling never fully went away. Those kids grew up. They had families of their own. And decades later, they still flinched when they heard loud noises, still checked the sky when planes flew overhead, still remembered what it felt like to sit in the dark and wait for the end of the world. If your grandmother or grandfather ever told you about the war and then kept the doors closed, avoided elevators, or jumped at loud noises, now you know where that comes from. It is not neurosis. It is the body remembering, a story that stayed with them for 70 years. Write in the comments if you've just realized something new about your own family.